What if the girl society rejects is the very one who saves a billionaire's family? This story of a homeless child teaching a billionaire's daughter will shock you, break your heart, and inspire you to the end. The gates of Chief Bernard's mansion towered above the streets of Maitama, Abuja. Inside, young Precious sat cross-legged on the pavement, clutching her mathematics homework. She frowned at the messy equations inside, her pencil tapping against the paper. Just outside the gate, a see-through gate, a thin girl in a faded yellow dress watched curiously. She was barefoot, her hair unkempt, her skin dusty from wandering the streets. Yet her eyes shone with sharp intelligence. Precious noticed her and asked softly, "Do you know this one?" Pointing at the math problem. The girl hesitated before nodding. "Yes, my name is Rhoda. I can help." Precious opened the gate and let Rhoda in. Rhoda knelt on the floor and explained the problem with surprising clarity, her voice steady, her hands tracing invisible numbers on the concrete. Precious's face lit up in understanding, and for the first time that week, she smiled at her homework. From the balcony above, Chief Bernard watched silently, his brows furrowed. The billionaire had seen many people beg at his gates, but never had he seen a child, ragged and homeless, teaching his daughter like a classroom teacher. His heart tightened, though he would not admit it. Something about this strange encounter stirred emotions he thought he had buried long ago. Chief Bernard descended the marble steps of his mansion, his presence commanding even in silence. "Precious," he called, his deep voice echoing across the compound. Precious froze, her pencil slipping from her hand. Rhoda stood quickly, dusting her dress nervously, her bare toes curling against the hot pavement. Bernard's sharp eyes swept over the girl. "Who is this? And why is she at my gate?" he demanded. Precious clutched her notebook tightly, her small voice trembling. "Daddy, she was helping me. She's really smart. Please don't send her away." Bernard studied Rhoda, his suspicion mixed with curiosity. Her clothes screamed poverty, but her words had carried confidence. "What's your name, girl?" he asked. Rhoda lowered her eyes and whispered, "Rhoda, I was just passing. She asked me for help." Bernard's jaw tightened. He didn't like strangers near his daughter. But Precious looked up at him with pleading eyes that reminded him so much of his late wife. He sighed heavily. "Fine. But this cannot happen again." Rhoda nodded quickly, clutching her tiny hands together. Precious, however, had already made up her mind. She wanted Rhoda as her friend. That night, Precious lay awake in her room, her thoughts circling around Rhoda. She remembered the girl's sharp eyes, her calm voice, and the way she explained numbers better than her teacher. Why would a girl like her be on the streets? She wondered aloud. She rolled over in her bed, staring at the ceiling decorated with glow-in-the-dark stars. Something inside her ached, a longing to see her new friend again. Precious whispered a little prayer, asking God to protect Rhoda wherever she was sleeping that night. Meanwhile, Rhoda sat under a broken streetlight near the market, hugging herself against the cold. She had no blanket, only the warmth of her determination. She replayed the moment with Precious in her mind, the joy of teaching, the feeling of being useful. It reminded her of her mother, who used to say, "Knowledge is a gift no one can steal." Her mother was gone now, and life had been cruel, but in Precious's smile, Rhoda had felt a glimmer of something she hadn't known in a long time. Hope. The next morning, as Chief Bernard sat at the breakfast table flipping through the day's newspaper, Precious cleared her throat nervously. "Daddy," she began, "can Rhoda come back today? Please." Bernard looked up from his paper, his stern face unreadable. "I told you yesterday, that girl doesn't belong here. She's probably a street child. You don't know her background." Precious leaned closer, her eyes wide and pleading. "But Daddy, she's my friend now. She helped me. Can't we at least let her come sometimes?" Bernard sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. He had built his empire on discipline, control, and caution. Letting strangers close to his family was against everything he believed in. But the thought of his daughter begging over another child touched a fragile corner of his heart. "If she comes again, I will decide what happens next," he said finally. Precious squealed with joy, running to hug him tightly. Bernard tried to keep his face stern, but a small smile tugged at his lips as he returned her hug. Later that day, as Precious played near the gate with her doll, she spotted Rhoda again, wandering past with a torn schoolbook in her hand. "Rhoda!" Precious shouted, running toward her. Rhoda's face lit up with surprise and joy. "You want me to help you again?" she asked shyly. Precious nodded eagerly and pulled her inside the gate. The two girls sat under a mango tree, books spread out, their laughter ringing through the compound. For the first time in years, the mansion felt alive with the sound of children's friendship. Bernard, sitting in his study, heard the giggles drifting through the window. Against his better judgment, he allowed it. He walked to the window and saw them. Precious in her clean, expensive dress, and Rhoda in her ragged clothes, leaning over a notebook as though they were equals. His chest tightened. Something about the sight stirred old memories of his childhood in the village, before wealth had swallowed his life. He shook his head, muttering, "This cannot continue," yet he could not bring himself to call them apart. The next day, Bernard decided to test this mysterious girl. He called her into his study, a large room with towering bookshelves and leather chairs. Rhoda stepped inside nervously, her bare feet leaving faint marks on the polished marble floor. Bernard placed a math problem on the desk. "Solve this," he said firmly. Rhoda studied it, bit her lip, and slowly began to explain. Her voice grew steadier with each step, and in minutes the problem was solved. Precious clapped her hands with delight. Bernard leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. Rhoda's eyes filled with sadness. "My mother taught me before she died. She said education is the only thing no one can take away. After she passed, I couldn't go back to school." Her voice cracked, but she held her chin high. For a moment, Bernard's stern face softened. He saw not just a ragged girl but a child with a spark, a resilience that reminded him of himself. He grunted, pretending to be unimpressed, though deep inside he was shaken. That evening, Bernard told Precious that Rhoda should not come again. "You have teachers. You don't need her," he said firmly. But Precious's face crumpled. "Daddy, please. She's my friend, not just a teacher. Why are you so harsh?" Bernard's heart twisted at his daughter's tears, but he remained silent. Precious, however, had inherited his stubbornness. She folded her arms and declared, "If Rhoda doesn't come, I won't study at all." Bernard stared at her in shock. His daughter had never spoken to him so boldly. "Precious," he barked, but she only shook her head and ran upstairs to her room. Bernard sat in silence, his hands trembling slightly. He had built skyscrapers, controlled politicians, and commanded respect, yet he could not control the tears of his little girl. That night, as he sat alone in his study, he whispered to himself, "What is happening to me?" Later that night, Bernard walked through the quiet mansion. In Precious's room, he found her asleep, clutching a teddy bear, her cheeks still streaked with dried tears. At her bedside lay the notebook Rhoda had used. Bernard picked it up and traced the neat handwriting. Something inside him shifted. He remembered being a poor boy in his village, studying under streetlights with borrowed books. He remembered the hunger, the shame, and the fierce determination to rise above it all. Rhoda's story echoed too closely with his own past. He sat on the edge of Precious's bed, watching her chest rise and fall in sleep. "Maybe God sent that girl for a reason," he whispered. But then his fears crept in. What if Rhoda was a danger? What if her background brought shame or trouble to his family? He closed the notebook, torn between the walls of his past and the fortress of his present wealth. Sleep eluded him that night. The following morning, Precious insisted on seeing Rhoda again. Bernard, weary and conflicted, allowed it but decided to follow them quietly. He watched as Precious and Rhoda walked beyond the mansion's gates to a small corner near the street. There, Rhoda showed Precious where she slept, an old, bench under a rusted shed, with nothing but torn books and a thin piece of cloth. Precious gasped. "But, you live here? All alone?" she whispered, tears filling her eyes. Rhoda nodded, her lips trembling. "Since Mama died. Papa left long ago. I only have my books now." Bernard's throat tightened as he listened. He had expected exaggeration or lies, but her reality was harsher than he imagined. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. Watching his daughter hold Rhoda's hand so tightly, refusing to let go, Bernard realized the choice before him was no longer about logic. It was about humanity. He stepped forward slowly, his shadow falling over both girls, and for the first time, his voice was gentle when he said, "Come with me." Back at the mansion, Bernard asked the housemaid to prepare food. Rhoda sat nervously at the dining table and used to the grandeur around her. Precious beamed proudly, as though she had brought home a long-lost sister. "Eat," Bernard commanded softly. Rhoda hesitated, then began to eat, her small hands trembling as she tasted food richer than anything she had eaten in months. Tears filled her eyes, but she blinked them back quickly. Bernard studied her quietly. The walls he had built around his heart were crumbling, brick by brick. For years, his life had been about wealth, status, and control. But now, staring at a barefoot girl who carried more dignity than many adults he knew, Bernard felt something different stirring inside him. He didn't say it out loud, but in his heart, he knew this was only the beginning. Precious woke up unusually early that Saturday, her excitement filling the mansion halls. She rushed downstairs, still in her pajamas, calling, "Daddy, Daddy, can Rhoda come spend the day with me?" Chief Bernard, seated at the breakfast table with his morning paper, sighed deeply. "Precious, she is not like you. She has no home, no family. Are you sure you want her here?" Precious nodded eagerly. "Please, Daddy, she's my friend." Against his better judgment, Bernard instructed his driver, Mr. Gide, to find Rhoda and bring her. The girls spent the day playing hide-and-seek around the grand house. Precious showed Rhoda her dolls, her games, and even her closet full of dresses. "Pick one," Precious insisted. Rhoda hesitated, then slowly tried on a soft pink gown. For the first time in years, she felt like a normal child, laughing freely without fear of hunger or mockery. Chief Bernard, watching from afar, felt something stir inside him, a warmth he had not known since his wife passed. It scared him, but he couldn't deny it. That evening, while Precious slept soundly, Bernard called Rhoda into his study. The mahogany shelves loomed over her, and she shifted nervously. "Tell me the truth," Bernard began, his voice firm but calm. "Where are your parents?" Rhoda lowered her head, her small voice trembling. "They died in a car accident. My uncle took me in, but his wife called me a witch and threw me out, and he never bothered to find me. I live anywhere I can. Washing plates for people in exchange for food, sometimes picking leftover food from waste bins. No one wants to take me in, so I sleep on the street." Bernard's chest tightened. The story pierced through the walls of steel he had built around his heart. But he pressed further. "Why were you at my gate that day?" Rhoda swallowed hard. "I was hungry, but when I saw Precious struggling, I wanted to help. That's all." Bernard leaned back, studying her carefully. There was no deceit in her eyes, only pain. For a moment, he imagined if it were Precious in her place, alone on the streets, starving. The thought crushed him. "You may go," he said softly, dismissing her. As she walked out, Bernard clenched his fists. He wanted to remain detached, but something about Rhoda's resilience and honesty made it harder each day. At school the following week, Precious noticed Rhoda hanging by the school gate, watching students go in. She waved happily, but a group of her classmates giggled. "Precious is friends with a beggar," one boy sneered. The children laughed cruelly, throwing paper at Precious. Tears filled her eyes, but she stood tall. "She's smarter than all of you," Precious shouted, clutching her books. Rhoda, hearing the mockery, turned away, embarrassed. When Precious returned home, she burst into tears, telling her father what had happened. Bernard's anger burned. How dare they insult my daughter because of a girl who only tried to help? Yet, Precious looked at him with determination. Daddy, Rhoda doesn't deserve this. She should be in school with me, not outside watching. Bernard was stunned by his daughter's compassion. That night he couldn't sleep. Her words kept replaying in his mind. Chief Bernard sat in his study with piles of business documents before him, but his mind was elsewhere. The image of Rhoda standing outside the school gate haunted him. How long can this continue? He muttered to himself. For years, Bernard had built his empire with discipline and distance, refusing to let emotions sway him. But now, his daughter's happiness and perhaps his own conscience depended on a homeless girl. Later that evening, Bernard spoke with Precious. Do you really want Rhoda in your life, even if people laugh at you? Precious nodded. Firmly. Yes, Daddy. She's my best friend. Bernard exhaled heavily, staring into his daughter's eyes. He realized Precious's compassion was the very thing his late wife had prayed for in their child. Maybe this was not just chance. Maybe it was fate. Precious's 8th birthday arrived with balloons, cake, and rows of invited children from Abuja's wealthy families. Yet Precious's heart longed for only one thing, to share the day with Rhoda. She ran to her father as guests began arriving, tugging his sleeve. Daddy, can I invite Rhoda? Please. Chief Bernard hesitated, his eyes shifting between his daughter's hope-filled face and the stern guests already murmuring in his living room. In the end, her eyes won him over. I will send the driver to go pick her, he said softly. When Rhoda walked in wearing a borrowed dress from the housemaids, silence fell among the guests. Children in lace gowns and polished shoes stared, some whispering cruelly, but Precious grabbed Rhoda's hand proudly and said, She's my best friend. Chief Bernard, watching from the background, felt an odd tug in his chest. He realized that, unlike the other children, Precious's laughter was genuine only when Rhoda was beside her. For the first time, he wondered if fate had planted this girl in their lives for a reason. One of the guests at the party was Mrs. Alhassan, a wealthy neighbor who always looked for ways to belittle others. She noticed Rhoda and frowned, leaning toward Bernard. Chief, who is that girl? She looks out of place. Bernard's lips tightened. She's Precious's friend, he replied firmly. But Mrs. Alhassan smirked. Be careful, Chief. These street children bring shame. They don't belong in our circle. Precious overheard and clutched Rhoda's hand tighter. Don't listen to her, she whispered. But Rhoda's face burned with humiliation and she pulled away. Later, Bernard found her outside, sitting alone by the garden fountain. Don't mind people's words, he said gruffly. Rhoda looked up at him, her voice small. But maybe she's right. I don't belong here. For the first time, Bernard softened. He knelt beside her and said, Belonging isn't about clothes or money. Sometimes it's about the heart. Rhoda blinked in surprise, a strange warmth spreading in her chest. Rain lashed Abuja that night, pounding rooftops and flooding streets. Bernard sat by the fire with Precious asleep on his lap, but his thoughts kept drifting to Rhoda. He remembered her sitting by the fountain, her shoulders hunched against Mrs. Alhassan's cruel words. Finally, he stood, grabbed his keys, and drove out into the storm. His car headlights sliced through the rain until he found her curled under a torn umbrella by the roadside, shivering. Bernard stepped out, his suit soaked instantly. Rhoda's eyes widened in shock. Sir? What are you doing here? He bent down, lifted her in his arms, and whispered, No child deserves this. The storm raged on, but inside his car, Bernard felt an unfamiliar peace. For once, he wasn't Chief Bernard the billionaire. He was simply a man saving a little girl from the cold. When Bernard carried Rhoda into the mansion, Precious ran toward them with a squeal. You found her, she cried, hugging Rhoda tightly. The servants exchanged shocked glances, but Bernard ignored them. Prepare a room for her, he ordered. Gasps rippled through the household. One of the older staff muttered, A street child? Living here? Bernard's glare silenced them all. Rhoda stood frozen in the grand hallway, her eyes darting over the chandelier, marble floors, and polished staircases. This place, it always feels like heaven, she whispered. Bernard bent slightly and replied, No, child, it's just a house. Heaven is when you feel safe. For the first time in years, Rhoda felt what safety might mean. She looked at Precious, who grinned ear to ear, and whispered back, Then maybe this is my heaven. Though Rhoda now slept in a soft bed and ate at the dining table, not everyone welcomed her presence. The servants whispered in corners, calling her the street girl, and questioning why Bernard had brought her in. One day, as Rhoda walked into the kitchen for water, she overheard two maids. She doesn't belong here, one sneered. Chief is losing his mind. Rhoda's eyes filled with tears, and she fled before they saw her. Precious found her crying in their shared playroom. What's wrong? She asked, alarmed. Rhoda shook her head. They don't want me here. Maybe your daddy will send me away too. Precious took her small hands and squeezed tightly. They don't decide. My daddy does. And he listens to me. Rhoda sniffed, unsure, but Precious's confidence wrapped around her like a shield. Chief Bernard had been watching Rhoda quietly, observing her behavior at home. One evening, he called her into his study. The room was lined with shelves of leather-bound books, intimidating even for adults. Rhoda stood nervously, clutching the hem of her dress. Bernard pushed a paper toward her. Read this aloud, he instructed. Her voice shook at first, but soon grew steadier as she read flawlessly. His brows lifted in surprise. He then asked, Who taught you to read this well? Rhoda lowered her gaze. My mother, before she died. Silence filled the study. Bernard leaned back in his chair, staring at the fragile child who carried pain deeper than her years. For the first time, he admitted to himself that Rhoda was not just a charity case. She was a child with untapped brilliance, and maybe, just maybe, she belonged in his family. When Bernard enrolled Rhoda in Precious's elite school, the reaction was swift and cruel. Children mocked her daily. Street girl, they chanted. Precious jumped to her defense, shouting, She's my sister. But the bullies only laughed harder. Rhoda returned home that day with swollen eyes and slumped shoulders. Bernard listened silently as Precious recounted the incident. Then he called Rhoda to sit beside him. The world will always try to remind you where you came from, he said gravely. But you get to decide where you're going. Rhoda blinked at him, her lip trembling. But what if I can't? Bernard rested his large hand gently on her shoulder. Then I'll remind you, every day, until you believe it. While exploring the mansion one afternoon, Rhoda discovered a dusty photo album tucked behind a bookshelf. She opened it curiously and froze. Inside were pictures of Precious's mother, a gentle-looking woman with the same smile as Precious. Bernard walked in just then and saw Rhoda holding the album. His face darkened, but not with anger, with grief. She was beautiful, Rhoda whispered, almost reverently. Bernard nodded slowly, his voice rough. Yes, she was everything. He sat beside Rhoda, something he had never done before. She died when Precious was 3. I thought I could never fill that emptiness. Rhoda, with the simplicity of a child, looked at him and said, Maybe emptiness is waiting for someone new to love. Bernard stared at her, stunned, realizing this ragged girl had just spoken words his wealth could never buy. One Saturday, Precious and Rhoda were playing by the garden pond when Precious slipped on the wet stones and fell in. She thrashed wildly, unable to swim. Rhoda screamed, then without hesitation, jumped in after her. She pulled and kicked with all her strength, struggling to keep Precious's head above water until the guards rushed in to help. Both girls were dragged out, coughing and soaked, but alive. When Bernard arrived, panic etched his face. He gathered Precious in his arms, then turned to Rhoda. You risked your life for her? She nodded weakly, teeth chattering. She's my friend. Bernard's throat tightened. For the first time, he didn't just see Rhoda as Precious's companion. He saw her as a daughter in every way that mattered. That night, Bernard couldn't sleep. He paced his study, replaying the image of Rhoda diving into the water without a thought for herself. She had nothing, no wealth, no family, no protection. Yet she had shown the kind of love money couldn't buy. He stared at the adoption papers he had requested days earlier, unsure if he had the courage to act. Finally, he walked to the girls' bedroom. They were asleep, curled against each other, hands clasped. Bernard's heart swelled painfully. He whispered into the dark, "Maybe this is what family really means." The next morning, he made his decision. Rhoda would no longer be the girl from the streets. She would be his daughter, officially and forever. Bernard stopped pacing and whispered aloud, "It's time." He sat at his desk and began making calls. His lawyers, his household staff, even the school principal. Everyone would need to know what he was about to do. For once, Bernard wasn't thinking about business deals or political influence. He was thinking about love, about family, and about second chances. The next morning, Bernard called Precious and Rhoda into the living room. The girls sat on the couch, their small hands clasped together nervously. Bernard stood before them, his tall frame casting a shadow, but his eyes were gentle. "Rhoda," he began, his voice soft but steady, "I've been thinking for a long time. You've brought joy back into this home. You've been a friend, a helper, a sister." Rhoda swallowed hard, her heart pounding. "From today, I want you to be more than just Precious's friend. I want you to be my daughter too." Precious gasped, throwing her arms around Rhoda. Rhoda's lips trembled as tears spilled down her cheeks. Your daughter?" she whispered in disbelief. Bernard nodded, his own eyes misty. "Yes, Rhoda. If you'll let me, I'd like to adopt you as my child." The following weeks, Bernard met with his lawyers. A background check was done on Rhoda's family background, and it was discovered that all Rhoda said were true. Her uncle had also passed on, leaving his wife and 8 children behind. They completed the adoption process, and Chief Bernard went home full of excitement to break the news to his household. Bernard gathered the staff in the grand sitting room. Precious stood by Rhoda's side, holding her hand tightly. "From this day forward," Bernard announced firmly, "Rhoda will no longer be a visitor in this house. She will live here as my daughter." Gasps filled the room, and murmurs rose among the staff, some in shock, some in joy. Precious screamed with delight, hugging Rhoda tightly. "I knew it. I knew Daddy would say yes." Rhoda, overcome with emotion, fell to her knees in gratitude. "Thank you, sir. Thank you, Daddy," she sobbed. Bernard bent down, lifting her up with surprising tenderness. "No more tears, child. You are home now." Not everyone welcomed the news. Some of Bernard's extended family were outraged. At a family gathering, his sister scoffed, "Bernard, how can you adopt a street child into our family? What will society say?" Bernard's jaw clenched. "Let society talk. I answer to my conscience, not to gossip." Another relative sneered, "Do you know her background? What if she disgraces us one day?" Bernard rose to his feet, his voice firm. "If this child, who has nothing, can carry herself with dignity and intelligence greater than some of you born with privilege, then perhaps she is more deserving of this family than you realize." The room fell silent, and for the first time, his relatives saw not just a billionaire but a man willing to stand boldly for what was right. Rhoda blossomed under Bernard's care. In school, she quickly rose to the top of her class. Teachers marveled at her brilliance, and Precious glowed with pride whenever she introduced Rhoda as her sister. The two girls became inseparable, bound by a friendship that had transformed into true sisterhood. On a bright Sunday morning, Bernard took both Precious and Rhoda to church. The whispers of the congregation followed them, but Bernard walked proudly, holding both girls' hands. During the service, he stood before the altar and publicly declared, "Today, I give thanks, for God has blessed me with 2 daughters, one by birth, one by grace. Together, they are my joy." The church erupted in applause, and tears streamed down Rhoda's face. From that day, Rhoda's life was forever changed. She was no longer the homeless girl who slept on the streets. She was Rhoda Bernard, daughter, sister, and heir to not just wealth, but to love, dignity, and belonging. And as Precious whispered in her ear that night, "I told you we'd be sisters forever," Rhoda finally believed that miracles could happen even to a girl who once had nothing. Moral lesson: never look down on anyone, because the child you ignore today may be the blessing you need tomorrow. Thank you for watching. Share with us in the comments what lesson you learned from the story, and let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, as we would be dropping more inspiring and emotional stories.